It was an unusually cold winter that year. Snow had fallen steadily for days, covering the entire town in a thick white blanket. The roads were empty, and the only sounds were the soft crunch of snow beneath the few people who dared to step outside. For most of the residents, the snowfall was something to enjoy. Children played, building snowmen, and families huddled inside by the fire. But for Sam, the snowfall brought a deep sense of unease. He had always liked winter, but something about this particular storm didn't feel right. Sam lived in a small cabin on the outskirts of town, surrounded by tall trees and thick woods. It was the kind of place that felt peaceful most of the time, but after the snowstorm, it felt isolated, almost too quiet. The storm had knocked out power in most of the area, and the roads leading to his cabin were completely buried under snow. He was used to being alone, but now, with the snow trapping him, it felt different, like the world outside had vanished. That evening, Sam stood by the window, looking out into the vast whiteness. The sky had cleared up, and the snow reflected the pale moonlight, making everything glow faintly. It was beautiful, but at the same time eerie. There was no movement, no sound. The woods, usually full of life, seemed completely still. It was then that Sam noticed something strange, a set of footprints leading into the woods. At first, he thought they might belong to a neighbor or a passerby. But as he looked closer, he realized that the tracks didn't make sense. They weren't human footprints. They were too large, too deep. And the strangest part was that they seemed to appear out of nowhere. There were no tracks leading from the road, just a trail that started deep in the woods and disappeared into the trees. A cold shiver ran down Sam's spine. He tried to brush it off as an animal, maybe a deer or a wolf. But something about the prints felt off, as if they had been made by something different. The more he stared, the more his unease grew. He decided to close the curtains and put it out of his mind, but the image of those strange tracks stayed with him. That night, as Sam lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and he could hear the creaking of the trees in the distance. He pulled the covers tighter around himself, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling gnawing at him. But just as he was about to drift off to sleep, he heard it, a faint knock at the door. Sam sat up, heart pounding. Who could be out there in the middle of the night, in the middle of a snowstorm? He waited, hoping it was just his imagination. But then it came again, a soft, deliberate knock, as if someone was standing just outside, waiting for him to answer. He hesitated for a moment before climbing out of bed and making his way to the door. The house was cold, and his breath fogged in the air as he moved. When he reached the front door, he paused, hand hovering over the doorknob. The knock came again, louder this time. With a deep breath, Sam pulled the door open. There was no one there. The cold wind rushed inside, biting at his skin. He stepped out onto the porch. Scanning the snow-covered yard, the footprints were still there, leading into the woods. But now they looked fresher, as if something or someone had been walking through them recently. His heart raced as he glanced around. But there was no sign of life, no movement except for the swirling snowflakes in the wind. Sam quickly shut the door, bolting it behind him. He leaned against it, trying to calm his racing heart. Something was out there, something he couldn't explain. But he wasn't about to go searching for answers in the dark. He returned to bed, but sleep wouldn't come easily that night. The knock at the door, the strange footprints, and the uneasy silence outside weighed heavily on his mind. Little did Sam know, that was just the beginning. The next morning, Sam woke to find the snowstorm had picked up again. The wind howled outside, and the snow continued to fall in thick, heavy flakes. His cabin felt colder than usual, and despite the fireplace crackling softly, there was a chill in the air that seemed to seep into his bones. He tried to go about his day as normal, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the events of the night before. He hadn't imagined it. Someone or something had knocked on his door. But who? And why had they disappeared so quickly? He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something was lurking just beyond the tree line, hidden in the snow. As he stood by the window, sipping his coffee, Sam noticed something that made his blood run cold. The footprints were back, but this time, there were more of them. They crisscrossed the yard, circling the cabin before disappearing into the woods. He hadn't heard anything during the night, no knocks, no sounds of movement, but the tracks were fresh, and they were everywhere. A knot of fear tightened in his chest. He knew he had to find out what was making those tracks, but the thought of stepping outside into the storm filled him with dread. Still, he couldn't just stay inside and ignore it. He had to know. Sam bundled up in his thickest coat, pulling on gloves and boots before stepping out into the cold. The wind bit at his face, and the snow crunched beneath his feet as he made his way towards the tracks. As he followed them, he noticed something strange. The footprints were deeper than before, as if whatever was making them had grown heavier. He followed the trail into the woods, his breath fogging in the cold air. The trees loomed overhead, their branches weighed down with snow. The deeper he went, the more uneasy he felt. There was something wrong about the woods today. It was too quiet, too still. Even the usual sounds of birds and animals were absent. The footprints led deeper into the forest, winding through the trees and over a small hill. Sam hesitated for a moment, wondering if he should turn back, but curiosity and fear drove him forward. As he crested the hill, he saw something that made his heart stop. At the base of the hill, partially buried in the snow, was an old, abandoned cabin. Sam stared down at the old cabin, his mind racing. He had lived near these woods for years and had never seen this place before. The cabin looked ancient, as if it had been abandoned for decades. The wood was weathered and cracked, and snow covered most of the roof. Yet there it stood, almost hidden in the dense forest. His eyes followed the strange footprints, which led directly to the front of the cabin. Sam's breath caught in his throat as he realized that whoever or whatever had made those prints had gone inside. He felt a strong urge to turn around and head back home, to pretend that none of this was happening. But something deep inside him, perhaps curiosity or the need for answers, kept pushing him forward. The wind howled through the trees as Sam slowly made his way down the hill, his footsteps muffled by the thick snow. Every step felt heavier, and the eerie silence around him only amplified the sound of his breathing. The cabin loomed larger as he approached, its windows dark and its doors slightly ajar. As Sam stood in front of the cabin, his heart pounded in his chest. He hesitated, wondering if he should just leave, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for him to come closer. With a deep breath, he reached out and pushed the door open. The hinges creaked loudly as the door swung inward, revealing the dark interior of the cabin. A gust of cold air rushed out, carrying with it the faint smell of damp wood, and something else, something metallic, like rust or blood. Sam's stomach turned as he stepped inside. The cabin was small, just one large room with a stone fireplace in the corner. The floor was covered in dust and old, rotting furniture was scattered around. There was a table near the fireplace, covered in what looked like old papers and scraps of fabric. But what caught Sam's attention was the wall. Scrawled across the walls in dark, dried streaks were strange symbols. They looked like nothing Sam had ever seen before, twisted, jagged shapes that seemed to pulse with some dark energy. His eyes followed the symbols, trying to make sense of them, but they only filled him with a growing sense of dread. Sam turned toward the fireplace and froze. There, in the corner of the room, was a figure. It was huddled in the shadows, motionless, its back turned to him. The figure was covered in a heavy cloak, and Sam couldn't tell if it was a person or something else. His mouth went dry, and his legs felt like they were glued to the floor. "Hello." Sam's voice cracked as he spoke, barely above a whisper. The figure didn't move. He took a step forward, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" Still, the figure remained completely still. Sam felt the overwhelming urge to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The silence was unbearable. He took another step closer, reaching out with a trembling hand. As his fingers brushed the edge of the figure's cloak, it shifted. Suddenly, the figure turned and Sam's heart leaped into his throat. It wasn't human. The face that stared back at him was twisted and deformed, its eyes black and soulless. Its mouth was stretched into a grotesque grin, and as it opened its mouth, Sam saw rows of sharp, jagged teeth. He stumbled backward, his body frozen in fear. The figure let out a low, guttural sound, like a growl mixed with a laugh. Sam's mind raced, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The figure stood up slowly, its movements unnatural and jerky. It towered over Sam, its presence filling the room with a suffocating sense of dread. Without warning, it lunged toward him, its arms outstretched. Sam finally broke free of his paralysis and turned to run. He bolted out of the cabin, his heart pounding in his ears. The wind whipped at his face as he sprinted through the snow, not daring to look back. He didn't know if the figure was chasing him, and he didn't care. All that mattered was getting as far away from that cabin as possible. By the time Sam reached his own cabin, he was breathless and drenched in sweat despite the freezing cold. He slammed the door behind him and collapsed against it, his chest heaving. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he had just seen. Was it real, or had his imagination gotten the better of him? But the memory of that face, the twisted, inhuman grin, was burned into his mind. He couldn't deny what he had seen. Something was out there, something that shouldn't exist. As Sam sat in the silence of his cabin, trying to catch his breath, he realized that he wasn't alone. A soft sound, almost like a whisper, came from outside the window. His blood ran cold as he slowly turned to look. There, pressed against the glass, was the same deformed face, grinning at him through the snow. Sam scrambled away from the window, his heart racing. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The figure's twisted grin was still etched on its face, and its black eyes seemed to follow his every movement. He backed up against the wall, unsure of what to do. His mind raced, but his body felt frozen in fear. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching him through the window, as if it was waiting for something. Sam's thoughts spiraled. How had it found him? Why was it here? What did it want? He had no answers, only the suffocating sense of dread that filled the room. Suddenly, the wind outside picked up, howling louder than ever. The snow swirled violently around the cabin, and the figure at the window slowly faded from view, as if it were disappearing into the storm. Sam stood in the middle of the road, completely alone. The snow was falling heavily now, covering everything in a thick, white blanket. His breath came out in short, sharp gasps as he looked around, trying to make sense of it all. The figure was gone, the cabin was gone, and now there was only silence. The wind howled through the trees, but otherwise, the world felt eerily still. Sam shivered, pulling his coat tighter around him, but it wasn't just the cold that was getting to him. It was the fear, the unshakable feeling that something was still out there, watching him. He thought back to the cabin, to the twisted face that had grinned at him through the window. It all felt like a nightmare now, but he knew it had been real. The symbols, the figure, the strange energy that seemed to pulse through the air, none of it made sense, but it had happened. Sam turned and started walking down the road, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. He didn't know where he was going, but he had to keep moving. The idea of staying still, of letting the snow cover him, was too terrifying. He needed to get away, to put as much distance between himself and that cabin as possible. But as he walked, the silence around him grew heavier. The trees loomed tall and dark on either side of the road, their branches bending under the weight of the snow. Every step felt like it was being swallowed by the white landscape, and Sam couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking in circles. He stopped and looked around. Everything looked the same snow-covered trees, the same endless stretch of road. It was as if the world had been swallowed by the storm, and Sam was trapped in it. Suddenly, a sound broke through the silence. It was faint at first, but it grew louder as it approached. Sam's heart raced as he turned toward the source of the noise. It was coming from behind him. He squinted through the falling snow, trying to see what it was. At first, he couldn't make out anything, just a blur of white. But then, slowly, a figure emerged from the storm. It was the same figure from the cabin, the one with the twisted face and the black eyes. It was walking toward him, its steps slow and deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world. Sam's blood ran cold. No, no, he whispered to himself, backing away. But the figure kept coming, its grin growing wider with each step. Sam turned and ran. He didn't care where he was going. He just needed to get away. The snow flew past him as he sprinted down the road, his legs burning with the effort. But no matter how fast he ran, the sound of footsteps behind him grew louder. He glanced over his shoulder and saw the figure closing in, its twisted face just feet away. Sam's heart pounded in his chest, and he pushed himself to run faster, but his body was exhausted. The cold bit at his skin, and the snow weighed him down. Just when he thought he couldn't go any farther, he saw something up ahead, a faint light shining through the snow. It was distant, barely visible through the storm, but it was his only hope. Sam focused on the light, forcing his legs to keep moving. The light grew brighter as he approached, and soon he could make out the shape of a small building, a house. Relief flooded through him as he stumbled toward it. He banged on the door, desperate for someone to open it. "Help! Please help me!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. The door creaked open and a figure stepped out. It was an old man, his face lined with age and concern. He looked at Sam, who was panting and covered in snow. "What's going on, son? You look like you've seen a ghost," the old man said, his voice calm and steady. Sam tried to catch his breath, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "There's something out there. It's following me. Please, you have to help me." The old man frowned and glanced out into the storm. "You'd better come inside. The storm's only getting worse." Sam didn't hesitate. He stepped into the warmth of the house, his body shaking from the cold and fear. The old man shut the door behind him, locking it with a heavy bolt. "Sit by the fire," the old man said, gesturing to a roaring fireplace in the corner. "You will warm up in no time." Sam collapsed into a chair by the fire, his mind racing. He could still hear the footsteps, still see the twisted grin. But as the warmth of the fire spread through his body, the terror began to fade. The old man sat across from him, watching him carefully. "You're safe now," he said. "Whatever was out there can't get in here." Sam nodded, but the fear still gnawed at the back of his mind. "I don't understand. What was that thing? Why was it after me?" The old man's face darkened, and for a moment he didn't say anything. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and serious. "This place, it's old, older than you or me. And there are things in these woods, things that don't belong to our world. Sometimes, they come out when the snow falls." Sam's stomach twisted. "What do you mean? Are you saying that thing wasn't human?" The old man shook his head. "No, it wasn't. And you're lucky you got away." Sam stared into the fire, trying to process everything. The warmth of the house felt comforting, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting for him. The old man stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the storm. "You can stay here for the night," he said, "but come morning, you need to leave. This place isn't safe when the snow falls." Sam nodded, his body too exhausted to argue. He lay back in the chair, his eyes heavy with sleep. But as he drifted off, he couldn't help but wonder if the old man was right, if the storm had awakened something ancient, something dangerous. And as the snow continued to fall outside, Sam knew that he would never forget the twisted face that had grinned at him through the storm.